A great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Javier Viera. Dr. Viera is the Dean of Drew Theological Seminary now. He has studied at Duke, Yale, and Columbia. Not only is he a dedicated pastor, but also an exceptional administrator and devoted teacher and a person of great integrity. As you know, next year, we Korean churches will celebrate 130th anniversary of Korean Protestantism. So that means that the first missionary sent by UMC, United Methodist Church, Reverend Henry Appenzeller, the founder of this church, Chungdong First Methodist Church, came to this land 130 years ago. So together with Drew Theological Seminary and Chungdong First Methodist Church, New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and Semunan Presbyterian Church, we will celebrate the birth of a Korean Protestantism and the ascending of Henry Appenzeller and Horace Underwood to Korea. As the new Dean of Drew, Dr. Viera visited Korea only 1 week with Reverend Hae-kyung Kang, who is working for external programs at Drew, and also beautiful work for the connection with many churches outside of Drew campus. And also here from this pulpit, I'm looking at Reverend Kang Byung-hun, who worked for Korean Methodist Church mission and missionary development. Would you please, two of you, Reverend Kang and Kang Hae-kyung 목사님, thank you for coming. So Reverend Kang Hae-kyung come together with Dr. Viera, only 1 week visit, but Dr. Viera is speaking in this historical place. We are so blessed and we are so honored and we are so gifted. As the new Dean of Drew, Dr. Viera is leading the faculty in the revisioning of its theological education program, and also he is responsible for supervising the training of ministers, religious leaders, and scholars, supporting faculty scholarship and development, and strengthening the graduate division of religion. As you know, Drew is one of the center of theological education in the States, and also a very special relationship with the Korean Methodist Church. So we invite him as today's speaker, and he will give us spiritual nourishment, and also he will give us a special lecture after this worship service. So why don't we welcome him with our special welcome with the Chung-dong method, with the big hands, even shouting, right? Let's welcome him together. Reverend Javier Viera.
I want to thank Reverend Lee and all of your pastoral leaders of this congregation for welcoming me. It is indeed a great honor for me to be here in this pulpit at this church, in part because of what you've just heard, is that one of our most distinguished alums from Drew Theological School was the founding pastor of this congregation, and that's a connection that is not lost on us at Drew, and that we value and cherish very much, not only for nostalgic reasons, but because we are fed so much even still by the Korean church, and we thank you for your faithfulness, your vitality, and your spirit of mission, which continues to nurture us. And so for me, it is a very, very special moment to be here with you today. So thank you. Now, with that said, we have to admit that we preach a very strange message. When you are able to take a step back and listen to the words of the gospel that were just read, with uncluttered ears, and if you're able to be honest with yourself, we would have to all admit how strange, how very, very strange this message that we proclaim actually is. In my part of the world, where I have pastored for the last 20 years, New York City, being a practicing Christian is increasingly countercultural. Impending secularism has won the day. It has won the day. There's no longer a struggle between the two, and there is a very clear winner. Now, that may surprise you to hear me say that, because for 20 years, that was the context in which I have pastored churches. But I can tell you that the cultural norm in the northeastern United States has so dramatically and so quickly changed that being a practicing Christian is now to claim a minority status. It is the exception, not the norm, to be a practicing Christian. And by the way, just as a point of reference, that is actually also true for the Korean American church, which may surprise you because for so many years it is the Korean American church that has been the stalwart of Christian life and vitality, but it is now too also beginning to see a decline in practice and vitality. Now, why do I share this with you? I share it with you because this reality, the reality of this context where I've pastored and where I now teach and where some of you have probably come from, we can no longer make the assumption that there is a generalized Christian understanding of Christian practices, of Christian metaphors, and of Christian language. For most of the history of the United States, that could be taken for granted. But it's simply not the case anymore. It was assumed that Judeo-Christian culture was the grounding force of community life. But again, that's no longer the case. And when we as Christians read texts like the one that we just read from the Gospel of John, even in our churches, we cannot assume that anyone knows what we're talking about. I am the bread of life. I am the bread that came down from heaven, and anyone who eats of this bread will never be hungry. What? To a largely secular culture, this sounds very odd. To the culture outside and inside the church, who no longer knows what to make sense of these strange words, we preach a very, very odd and peculiar message. Now, how do modern people make sense of such words? That's the challenge that places like this, I would imagine, here in the middle of Seoul, places like Drew, where I live out my ministry, that's the challenge that we have to take on. We have to make the gospel accessible to a culture and a generation who no longer think they need it, who are no longer compelled or inspired by it, and who frankly find it strange. That's the context. That's the context where most of our ministry now takes place. And I have to tell you, I have to be honest with you. I I love that context. I find it thrilling and exciting. I find it the most important work that there can be to make the words of Jesus fresh and real and meaningful for a skeptical audience. Because I think that's what ministry is all about. So let's ask the question again. What is Jesus talking about when he says these very strange words? I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of me will never be hungry. How do we make sense of these today? There was a woman in my last church whose name was Carol. Carol came to us one day after our morning worship service was finished. And she walked into the church with her 3 children. She had never been there before. And having been stuck on a train that morning, she was late to her own church. And having been late to her own church, this was the nearest Christian house of worship that she could find when she got off the train. I was shaking hands at the back of the church, greeting my congregation, when she burst through the doors, and she made quite a commotion as she walked in. She wasn't subtle or quiet or meek at all. Is it over, Pastor? Is it over? Is there any left? I was confused, and in a less, I have to admit, in a less than graceful way, I told her sharply that yes, worship had ended. Is there any left? She asked. I didn't know what she was talking about. I had no idea what she was talking about. Is there any left? She insisted. Since she had interrupted me now several times, I was now a little upset. I turned to her and I said very directly, I do not know what you mean, but worship is over and I'm trying to greet my congregation. Please step in line and wait your turn. That's exactly what she did. She went to the back of the line with her children, who ran boisterously around the sanctuary. And when it was finally her turn to speak with me, I extended my hand very politely, and I welcomed her to our church. She thanked me and asked again, is there any left? And at that point I said, I honestly do not know what you mean. But her explanation almost made me weep. I usually go to a church downtown, she told me, but the trains were moving slowly this morning. I got off the train and I ran to the nearest church that I could find, because at my church, I'm the communion steward. I usually clean up the altar after the communion service, and whatever bread is left over, the pastor lets me take home. It's often the only thing my children and I eat on Sundays. And so the pastor always makes sure that put a little extra out so that we can take it home with us. I didn't know what to say. I was speechless. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I felt deeply convicted by the way that I had received her into my church. Yes, I told her, there is some left. There is some left. It's in the back. If you come with me, you can have anything that's still there. So we went to the sacristy where our communion stewards were still cleaning up after the service, and I asked them for all the bread that was left over. I put it in a bag and I gave it to her, and I told her our congregation bakes its own bread, and our recipe calls for a little honey, so it's sweet. I hope your children like it. She took it from me, she tasted it, she gave it to some of her children, and it was clear that this was the first thing that they had to eat that day. And then she said to me, "This is the best tasting Jesus I've ever had." And we both laughed. But I've never forgotten that moment. And I've never forgotten it because it was in that moment that I realized that to Carol, these words of Jesus, "I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of this will never go hungry," those words were not strange to her at all. They made perfect sense. When he said, "I am the bread of life," he might as well have been speaking directly to her and to her children. As I watched her eat, I remembered the words of Gandhi, who, when reflecting on the Christian practice of Eucharist or communion, said, of course, God comes to us as bread. With so many hungry people in the world, God could not come in any other form. So you see, part of what makes these words strange for so many in our culture, and maybe even for some of us here, is that we've never really known true need. We've never been at that moment in our lives when we are so desperate that they are the only thing that makes sense to us, that the only thing we're hungry for is God. While our technological advances and increasing cultural sophistication are all good and helpful advancements, they've had a spiritual impact on us. Can a people who have never known hunger, can a people who have never known need have room within for God? Does our material success compromise our ability to make sense of the many ways in which God comes to us every day? You see, the scandal of the Christian message is that God came to us in material form. God became man. That's the central point of Christian proclamation. No other religious tradition makes that point. We alone do. We have many, many similarities with other traditions, but what sets us apart is that God entered matter. God became flesh. God became food for God's people. That's the scandalous claim of our faith. And in the Christian tradition, there is no distinction between the sacred and the profane, the physical and the spiritual. In Jesus, all are one. That is a scandalous claim. But it's a dangerous claim. It's a dangerous claim, too, because what it means for us is that this God we worship cannot be easily contained. The God of Jesus is not one who can be easily described or limited. The God of Jesus is an adventurous God, always revealing himself in ways that we cannot anticipate and much less control. Toward the end of today's passage, which we read, the people from Jesus' village say, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How could he say to us, 'I've come down from heaven'?" Now don't be fooled. Don't be fooled about what they're really saying. It isn't simply that they remember him from when he was a little boy, and that perhaps he was a bit mischievous and a hyperactive boy. Who knows? Who knows what memories they had of him as a child? But that wasn't their main concern. No, what they are really struggling with, what they're wrestling with in this moment, is a much more radical question. They're essentially saying to Jesus, don't tell us anything new about God. Don't tell us that God is coming to us in new and different ways. We have God figured out. We know what we're supposed to do, when we're supposed to do it, and where it's supposed to be done. Don't mess that up. We finally have it figured out. You see, their resistance isn't so much a resistance to Jesus, it's really a resistance to the new movement of God in their midst because they feel secure and safe with their prior knowledge of God. But we can't make the same mistake. If Jesus taught us anything, it is that God comes to us regularly, consistently, intentionally, in surprising ways. The God we worship comes to us sometimes even as bread and wine. The God of Jesus speaks to us through people that we would never expect, like this hungry woman in my congregation. And because of her and her children, I was taught a new perspective on what it means that Jesus is the bread of life. And so, friends, for us, that's the challenge. That's the challenge for us in making this strange message credible and real to an outside world who may be skeptical about our practices and our language. That's the challenge. And the challenge is that we remain open, that we remain expectant for the many ways in which God comes to us. Be ready. Be alert. Be excited for it. Be prepared. Because God does still move today. God is still being made known today, in this very moment. Maybe even at this very table.